Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Hammer for tonight's Los Angeles premiere of the new documentary War Game, which debuted at Sundance in January to great acclaim. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues at the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA Law School for co-presenting this program with us. Tonight's program will begin with a screening of War Game, which documents an unscripted role-play exercise set on January 6th, 2025, in which the United States has to handle a political coup attempt in the wake of a contested presidential election. In the role-play simulation, real U.S. defense, intelligence, and elected policymakers spanning 5 presidential administrations took on roles as characters in the exercise. And I'm very pleased to say that a number of them are here tonight with us for a post-screening discussion, including former Governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, who plays the role of the president, former U.S. Senator from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp, in the role of senior advisor to the president, Elizabeth Neumann, the former Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of Homeland Security, in the role of Homeland Security Advisor, Marine Corps veteran Janessa Goldbeck, who's now the CEO of the Vet Voice Foundation in the role of Governor of Arizona, and retired Army National Guard Major General Linda Singh in the role of Chief of the National Guard. The discussion also includes War Game directors Tony Gerber and Jesse Moss, Ben Radd, who designed the simulation and who's the founder of Fascination Lab, and our moderator tonight is Rick Hasen. He's a UCLA professor of law and political science and one of the foremost scholars of American election laws, and he's also the director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. The events in this film are very realistic, and what's at stake is very serious. The last American Civil War claimed more lives than any other conflict in U.S. history. As we approach Memorial Day, which was originally created to honor those who lost their lives fighting in the Civil War, I hope you'll think about what you see and hear tonight. We're just 7 months away from January 6, 2025, and it's critical that we ensure a peaceful transfer of power, no matter what the election outcome is. So after the screening and discussion, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some refreshments in the Hammer Courtyard, and I hope you'll stay and join us if you can. I think people coming together is just what we need right now. So now to introduce the film, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the film's executive producers, Warren Littlefield and Jonathan Steinberg.
Good evening. Claudia, thank you so much. We appreciate that warm welcome. Just a couple of thoughts and remarks before we get underway. I think we study history to learn from the past in order to make a better future. And it was that notion that 3 retired U.S. generals penned an op-ed in the Washington Post. They proposed a war game to examine the events of January 6th. They added a little caveat. They said, what if the military sided with the insurrectionists? Let's look at that. Let's be prepared for what that future might hold. Well, Vet Voice Foundation accepted that challenge, and they're the ones who put together the War Game. They also reached out to my good friend and my producing partner on The Old Man, John Steinberg, and fortunately for me, John picked up the phone and called me. I do want to thank, we had 3 critical partners in making this, Boat Rocker, Matador Content, and Anonymous Content signed on very early on and said, we believe in this project. I think at the end of the day, we made this film because we love America, and we also love democracy. Here's my partner, John.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. Well, I'll keep it short. When we had an opportunity to get involved with this project and to try to help get this movie made, I think what drew me to it is I wanted to see this movie. I had never seen a disaster thriller that takes place around a conference table, and I wanted to. And we did, and I think that this movie is that in some sense. But I think what it also is, once this team came together, a really remarkable cast of role players, very serious people. And our creative team. It became a movie about something else also. I think it's a movie about professionalism. I think it's a movie about a culture of service and patriotism, that there's no bad time to be celebrating, but there's no better time than right now. And the corralling of that story, those multiple stories, and the curating of it was really due to the brilliance of our directing team, who I would like for you to meet right now, Jesse Moss and Tony Gerber.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. I'd like to, in particular, thank Warren and John for their wise counsel, joining us on this leap of faith to make this film. This screening tonight here at the Hammer is really the embodiment of what we hoped for, to share the film and this conversation with people in a room, and talk about it afterwards. So thank you for coming out. And now my co-director, Tony Gerber.
Thank you, Jesse. What a joy to be screening at the Hammer. I mean, this museum is really the confluence of art and social justice. Making War Game was a rare opportunity for us to make something formally different, to point a camera at an epic improvisation by non-actors playing roles in a fictionalized scenario with grave real-world consequences. It was a privilege and a challenge to document. It's our hope that this film, our humble offering tonight, can wake those who at this late hour are still, in the words of Liz Cheney, sleepwalking their way into a dictatorship. Thank you. We look forward to talking to you afterwards.
Well, I think we have our marching orders. And I'm glad we're going to have a cash bar outside after this. So I'd love to give another round of applause to the filmmakers and participants. Please join me in welcoming Director Tony Gerber, Director Jesse Moss, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Major General Linda Singh, Governor Steve Bullock, Vet Voice CEO Janessa Goldbeck, Department of Homeland Security's Elizabeth Neumann, who, by the way, has a fascinating new book out called Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And we will have copies of these available for purchase in the Hammer lobby. And last but certainly not least, UCLA law professor Rick Hasen. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudia, and thanks to all of you for scaring the hell out of me again, having watched this another time. There are a lot of you and a lot of people in the audience, so I'm going to ask each of you a question or two, then maybe a couple of general questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some audience questions. And let me start with Janessa. You and your organization, Vet Voice, came up with the idea for this film. Can you talk a little bit about where did the idea come from? How did you select the participants? How did you get such an illustrious group to agree to play this game?
Sure. Well, as you can imagine, it was not easy to find people who had the moral courage to say yes to appearing on camera in an unscripted exercise about a potential coup in America. But we were so fortunate to find these folks who were not only willing to say yes and participate in the project, but also do events like this, because we feel like this film is so important to not just be something people watch and then fall into a pit of despair, but engage in a conversation around what's at stake in our democracy. So we're very fortunate as an organization to have a lot of relationships with folks, but it was a lot of everyday people picking up the phone and calling. One of our executive producers actually pulled the thread that got us to some of the leaders that you see here. So it wasn't just Vet Voice, it was also our production team, and we're really fortunate to have found the folks we found.
Great. And let me turn to the directors, Jesse and Tony. And I want to ask you just a couple of questions and have you each respond. First, I want to hear a little bit about how you got involved in the film, what made you want to take it on, but also what was unique about this film compared to other documentaries and other work that you've each done?
Sure. Well, I think first the film, for me, comes from trying to reckon with what we lived through on January 6, 2021, what that event means and what it foretells for our future. And when I heard about this exercise, it did scare me, but also felt like a way to interrogate, to confront that history and imagine that future. And I think that I didn't actually expect to be inspired, but when I first met Janessa and her organization and some of the participants, I think I felt that there was something positive in the darkness, and that was important to me. I think I'm looking for reasons to feel hopeful and people who make me feel hopeful, and I found that through this exercise. And I think what excited me as a filmmaker was this really extraordinary space or intersection of documentary, improvisational theater, and dystopian science fiction, which I don't think I've seen before in a film, certainly not in a document. There are great antecedents actually in documentary, stretching back to the work of Peter Watkins, and there are other films that inspired us. Tony has one foot, maybe a foot and a hand in the theater too, and so these were, I think, things we shared and interests we shared.
Tony?
Yeah, I mean, Jesse pretty much nailed it, but the idea of catharsis is really important, right? It was critical for us that this wasn't just food for the head, right? This wasn't just an exercise for folks inside the Beltway, that we could play to a larger audience and a larger crowd, and largely by appealing to the heart, and to make this almost a piece of genre work, right? That was engaging, so that the ideas go down easily. And one of the things I'm most proud about in the film is how I believe that these guys here and this piece of work reclaims the term patriot, right, which has been so co-opted, right? And I am so proud to be on the stage and to have worked with all of these patriots. And I feel like I really understand the word now, and I'm not sure that I did before we made the film.
Governor Bullock, I can't imagine what it's like to have your sweat up on the big screen on your brow, but I know as I was sitting here watching the film, I was agonizing along with you. Can you just take us into your head in the kind of the culminating scene when you're deciding whether or not to invoke the Insurrection Act? As you said at the beginning, you did a lot more listening than talking, but then you had to make a call. So if you could just walk us through a little of that and reflect on it.
Yeah, two things. First of all, we were all given about 6 pages walking in. So didn't even know that the crux of the exercise was really to try to see if the president was going to invoke the Insurrection Act. So that it was agonizing. I mean, but from the perspective of, I think I said at one point during the movie, it's about securing the election, but it's also what happens the day after the election. And the fog of war was, a lot of these great folks here were telling me to do different things. What could go wrong, Senator? But ultimately trying to say, I think there was some advantage to have been formerly a governor, because I knew about things like mutual aid and what you could do with the National Guard without the president there. But ultimately saying, can you do what you need to do without invoking the Insurrection Act?
So Governor Heitkamp, you were kind of right at the side. You were, a key voice in the president's ear. Can you reflect a little bit on what your approach was? Like, I take it you didn't have any more advanced warning than anyone else. You seem to be a little bit better prepared and less flustered than some of your compatriots. So can you talk a little bit about that?
It's interesting because you get in the moment, and on January 6th, I was actually doing some commentary for ABC. And so I was watching it in real time and expected to respond to this. And I kept watching it thinking, almost out of body experience. And you can see in the very beginning, I came in pretty hot. I came in pretty aggressive. And I think it was because I was thinking about what happened on that day and the reaction and the injury that was done to this country. And so For me, it was reliving that experience. But I think in some ways, and this is no knock on anyone out here on the platform, but that's a building I worked in. These are people I worked with. Eugene Goodman, who was famously the police officer, the Capitol police officer who led people away, he is one of my best friends, and I'm not exaggerating. And so all of this was incredibly personal to me. And so to see it happen again in this simulation, almost in real time, almost triggered me. And you can see the kind of emotional reaction, like, not again. No way are we going to let this happen. And so for me, it was, calming down during the course of the simulation, but also recognizing that our democracy is incredibly fragile, and it relies on people to do the right thing. And I think in the end, we did the right thing. We did not do what the red cell wanted us to do, but yet we were able to, I think, secure the election and move forward. But as Governor Bullock, as we affectionately call him, President Hot Ham, it's Hotham, but when you look at the button, it says Hot Ham. President.
And this will be the senator's last time she's invited on the stage.
I no longer am his senior advisor. Anyway, he did absolutely the right thing, and so it was a very important exercise, and I was proud to be part of it. But people ask me all the time, why did you join? And I said, because we have gaslit what happened on January 6th, and we cannot do that if we're going to protect our democracy.
General Singh, first of all, happy birthday. What could be more fun than talking about the end of American democracy on your birthday? So
you don't want to know the answer to that.
So I guess I want to ask you kind of a two-part question. One is, how realistic is the rogue threat in the military today? And second, having watched this a second time, it didn't occur to me the first time, but it really struck me this time, was how asymmetric the warfare was in terms of the information war versus kind of the reality. And I'm wondering, how well does that reflect what you think about the risks in the United States?
So first, let me address the first piece of that is just really this whole thing of extremism. And so I want to make sure that we understand that it's not just within the military, it's within the police, it's within society. And that is problematic because we, the military, recruit from society. The police recruit from society. And so therefore, it's going to end up within the ranks. And I think the challenge is that we have especially in the military, we have very, very strict rules on what we should and shouldn't do. So how are we going to deal with this going forward? I think we're all struggling with, right? Like, we want to be able to give people the ability to have this level of, okay, free speech and free this, but when you put that uniform on, when you raise your right hand, it basically, you basically say you are under oath. And if you're in the National Guard, you're not only under oath to the U.S. President, the United States, you're under oath to your state. And so that is a very different level. And so therefore, we're held at a higher standard, which means one person coming into the ranks is one person too many. And so we have to figure this out. And I feel like we're struggling with how do we go about it? How do we do it in a way that's going to allow us to continue to recruit and have a force that's all volunteer? Because think about it, right? We're in an all volunteer force. And so without having to go back to a draft, and oh, by the way, if we're going to go back to a draft, then our policy has to be revamped because the draft basically says we're drafting all men. And that's, I'm sorry, bullshit, right? So we don't want to go backwards in that. And then the second piece of that is, when we're looking about this communication, the piece that I want everyone to take away from this is do not, like we do this constantly. We look at something on social media, especially the young group, They're looking at, what happens on social media. They're taking that particular piece of information and it is gospel. And that is the worst thing you can do. You need to dig. You need to research. I wish everyone would get a degree in research. Like research and make sure that you know where that source is coming from and how you're going to select that information. And I think, the one thing that I've learned even from the military side is you cannot lead by looking at what's happening on a news story, on social media, or any of those platforms. You've got to dig deeper. That might be your first piece of information, but if you do not go deeper, then you are missing a whole particular, kind of overall picture, situational awareness picture that's going to allow you to make a better decision. And so we need to teach everyone how to be able to do that, because I think so much information is out there. We're not able to sift through all of it very well.
And on the point about the realism of the asymmetry in terms of how this thing might spell.
Well, okay. I'm just going to be realistic. It is possible. It is possible that we are going to be faced with, okay, let me give you this scenario, because this to me is probably really scary. You see what's happening on college campuses. Look at that expanding and actually having an uptick come January. And then you have on top of that people who are unhappy about whichever way it doesn't even matter who gets elected. Someone's not going to be happy. And you throw that on top of it and look at what's happening now in and around our cities, our states. How are we going to deal with that? So let's be realistic. Let's not hide from it and say that is very possible and it is very feasible. So now what are we going to do to make sure that we can handle what's coming at us? I mean, if you're looking at a train coming through a tunnel, are you going to say, oh, that's a train? Or are you going to say, okay, maybe I should move. Maybe I should do something. Maybe I should do something else. Okay, so that's what we need to do.
Well, that brings me to Elizabeth. You've studied domestic terrorism and extremism. What do you think is driving some ordinary people to do things like we saw on January 6th? And what can we do to minimize the chances of these things festering and spreading?
For 20 years, we've tried to understand why people radicalize. Why does somebody move to extremism? And worse, why do they mobilize to violence? And the good news is we actually have answers now that we didn't have 2 decades ago. The underlying drivers are psychosocial. It's not the ideology. It's not Islamic jihadist ideology. It's not white supremacist ideology. It's not anti-government ideology. There's something else. There's an unmet need that has allowed somebody to be open to that ideology providing a false answer. So why does that matter? It matters because trying to argue somebody out of their ideology actually doesn't work. It actually creates a backlash effect. They get more entrenched. They feel like you're attacking them. It matters because if we want to stop it, rather than focusing on ideology, and there's a role for that. Academics love to have boxes to check and bins and being able to count how many attacks were motivated by this versus that. There's value to it, but it actually doesn't stop it. What stops it is getting to those underlying psychosocial needs, and the top 2 can be binned. It's very complex. I'm oversimplifying here, so if anybody's a PhD in psychology, please, happy to talk afterwards. I'm oversimplifying. The 2 needs are significance and belonging. And what we are dealing with as a society, writ large, is a challenge with finding meaning in life, and we're increasingly a very isolated society. Those 2 lacks result in a multiple of societal ills: deaths of despair, opioid addiction, domestic violence, gang violence. It's not just extremism, but extremism is one of those harms. And so we have right now in our society a whole group of people, I wrote an entire book about it because I come from this community, who feel like, as a group, they're increasingly losing power, they're being humiliated, ostracized, persecuted in a way. They feel that. That's not necessarily how I would classify it. And they're lashing out. Some people are healthy enough to say, I'm feeling this grievance. It's a legitimate grievance. I am feeling humiliated. I am no longer a part of the mainstream. But their answer to that is not hostile action. Their answer is, I'm going to vote differently, or I'm going to build in my own community something flourishing, or I'm going to turn the other cheek if you're a Christian. That's what our scriptures teach. But there's a whole lot of people who have come to look for certainty, for security in a person or in a politician or in a means of violence. And that's the definition of extremism. When we perceive a threat to our success or survival from this outgroup, however we define that, and we then look for hostile action to address that problem. And we have way too many people in this country, the stats are like 30 to 40%, which are cognitively open to the idea that violence is necessary to achieve our political agenda. That is the definition of terrorism. Now, most of those people are not going to mobilize to violence. But the fact that we have so many that are just cognitively open to it is a huge problem. It's a huge problem for the way that we interact with each other. It kind of creates just a unpleasant place to be in, but it's also a huge problem for security services. We don't have the security services, the law enforcement. You don't want the military and the intelligence community doing domestic law enforcement work. I mean, we just don't have the resources to actually deal with the problem that size. So what do? You need to do something. I need to do something. We need to stand up and say, you know what? We can have a lot of disagreement, but violence is not the solution.
Ben, my fellow Bruin, or I would like to call you the puppet master, you were the one wearing the headset in the film. You were the one, your Fascination Labs designed this project. Tell us a little bit about how you put this together and what it is that you thought which directions do you think this might have gone in?
So as I mentioned in the film, I'm a product of a revolution myself, and having seen something that was stable topple suddenly, and then seeing it again, 9/11 brought some of that back, and then January 6th brought some of that back. And the question is how do otherwise stable societies become, how do they lose that stability? How do we get to the point where we let that happen? And oftentimes it's a failure of imagination. We just simply didn't anticipate that a cascade of awful things could happen and we would lose control. So I said, how can we recreate that for this domestic exercise, for domestic purposes, and try to revisit it. So the goal was to basically create as many chaotic events happening simultaneously, one triggering the other. And then also one of the things I hope that came across that maybe you all noticed was the role of social media. I wanted to create a fake Twitter for the film, or for the war game. And one of the things I wanted to see was, could the White House, could the US government keep up with the red cell trolls on social media? They could not. I instructed the trolls to just go as hard and as fast as they could. And I gave counsel to the White House, and I said, think about matching them, at least to some extent. And time again, they struggled to do that. And several of the participants noted that. And so, again, that's what we're seeing. I teach here at UCLA. I teach Middle East politics. So a lot of what's been taking place on the campuses, I'm seeing also that misinformation gets spread on social media, and it's hard to combat that in real time. And we saw that in the film as well. So that was something I wanted to be brought into the film. And it is a battle that sadly we are losing. And it's one that I want us to be mindful of.
Well, we certainly know that the federal government doesn't usually move at any quick kind of pace, and this called for it. Before I turn to audience questions, I want to ask a couple of general questions. And let me just first turn to Jesse and Tony, then everyone else. When I was at dinner with some of the team before the film started, someone said, the people who need to see this film the most are the ones who are least likely to see it. And I want you to reflect on, how in this partisan moment do you get people to think about these things and to get to kind of abandon their kind of positions and see where things might go and how we might preserve our democracy.
Well, I would take issue with that because I think that the way Janessa and her organization designed this scenario, inviting people who were on both sides of the aisle and nonpartisan, who come from the military, I think created a space that allows people to come to the film and the conversation from different points on the political spectrum. We can acknowledge that there is a percentage of the electorate, significant, that will not come, but they don't. That's okay. You know, I think the film does create a space for conversation. We have fictional candidates, fictional events. I think you can map onto that what you will. But I think that does create an opportunity for people to be receptive to the conversation here. I think the film is also not dogmatic. It's experiential, and I think it leaves a lot for discussion. So I think we'll see if it's successful. I think it's our ambition to take the film to battleground states and to road test this idea and see if we can bring people into the theater, not in LA and New York and San Francisco, but in other places who want to have this conversation. That's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I think we're up for it.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. You know, when we made this film, Trump was not part of the national conversation, right? He wasn't part of our nightly news cycle. And it wasn't even clear that he was going to be the Republican candidate, right? So it's funny that folks bring Trump to this film, right? It's like he's the sort of the unspoken. He's the Prince of Darkness who's just off screen. You know, as Jesse mentioned, one of our strategies is going to be to drop into colleges and universities in purple states, right? And we hope that the film can in some way move the dial and generate conversation. That's one of the things that's very important to us, and that's one of the things that we see when we screen it in venues like this, that people want to stick around afterwards and talk. They need to talk, and we all need to talk. And that's why it's so important to us that we're having this national theatrical release, right? We're not racing to the streamers. Once it's on the streamers, that's great, you know? Be very excited for it to be on a big streamer, a streaming platform. But folks watching this alone on their laptops or in their homes is very different from what's going on here now, right? So this is I think this is the way we kindle a small prairie fire that spreads. That's the hope.
I would just quickly add, and I'm not the expert on this panel on the Insurrection Act, but I think the issue is evergreen regardless of the outcome, and in future elections too. I think. This was not the issue I expected this story to turn on. I didn't know anything about the Insurrection Act. It's actually been widely discussed in the New York Times and other papers in the last 6 months. And I think it will matter regardless of who is president.
Governor Bullock?
It struck me, Professor, when you said that watching this you were terrified. How many people were terrified? And I think really what ought to be terrifying is 171 members of Congress from 37 different states right now. 1/3 of the Congress actually denies the results of the last election. I mean, what ought to be terrifying is the third highest ranking member of the House says, we'll see if it's a valid and legal election before we'll make any decisions. So from that perspective, I think directly to your question, I mean, this is a conversation we all have to be having. That I've been on the side of losing elections, and guess what? They suck. But at the end of the day, there's something so much more important than who wins and who loses. And every time I ran for office, I'd say, this is the most important election in our lifetime. Guess what? This is the most important election in our lifetime. And because even more than that, the conversations that you can have coming out of this movie are important, because what we have to do is protect that experiment called representative democracy. And I think you would probably agree, Professor, that it's being tested in ways certainly that it hasn't been in a long time, when 1/3 of the members of Congress from 37 states won't even actually say, here's what happened in 2020, let alone what's going to happen in 2024.
Well, I was hoping at this stage in my career that I'd be going off to emerging democracies and looking at how they're building. Not that we would have to have the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA. There's been a retrogression of the position. Which leads me to the final question I want to ask each of you to weigh in on. And maybe we'll start with Ben and just work our way down the line, and then I'll open it up to questions, which is how hopeful are you, how fearful are you about democracy over the next decade in the United States?
Cautiously optimistic.
Do you want to give a sentence or two of explanation?
I'm around a lot of young students, college students, and they, despite everything, still, I think, believe in the system. They're not jaded yet, and so I think I'm putting a lot of faith and stock in generations to come.
Elizabeth.
I think we are in for periods of darkness ahead. But when you talk about it in terms of a decade or two, maybe, I have great hope. I think we're trying to awake the exhausted majority. I think the majority of this country are good-willed people. They are sleepwalking and or just exhausted from the chaos. And it's a normal thing to retreat from the chaos. We need them to wake up. We need them to step forward. We need them to advocate within their communities as well as nationally to reset those norms of civility and kindness to one another, even when we disagree, that violence is not an option, and that could we please elect people that actually have character and competence to do the job.
I think one of the things Elizabeth says that really always strikes me when we do these panels or events is about the psychosocial draw to extremism or extremist ideology. And I think when we think about how many people in this country don't even vote, how many people in this country don't believe that democracy actually is a system that works for them because, quite frankly, they've been left out of any sort of gains. We don't really talk about the political division in this country through the lens of class. And yet we live in a time when economic disparity is increasing and people who are struggling and working hard are still not getting their needs met in a way that is very different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so I feel cautiously optimistic that people will see through the chaos and the vitriol and make a choice that is based on, hoping to see the future of representative democracy continue. But I think we need to, as an entirety of our society, have a more honest conversation about the politics. And instead of being so tribal about our political beliefs, really talk about class and economics. And we're not having that conversation now in a way that I think is meaningful to most people, and not making the case why democracy actually matters, because if your life doesn't change, depending on who's in the office, why does it matter to you? And why wouldn't you go for the person who is the angriest and the most sort of divisive?
Governor?
I am very, very concerned. I'm damn concerned. And I do think we are at that moment of inflection that I hope that we get through in about 170 some days. Often I think as people, it's not until something's taken away from us that it really wakes us up. And I think Jesse said at the start about who the patriots were, and all these folks were patriots. But I think what we need to make sure is that this is a wake-up call, because it can be taken away from us, and it can be taken away from us right now. So I'm deeply concerned, but as someone that spent most of his life in public service, as a father of 3 children, I have to believe that we can rise to this challenge like we've risen to so many other challenges in the past.
General?
I'm glad you ended on that, because I was like, oh no. So while I'm concerned, and I'm constantly thinking about it, and I'm constantly trying to work on behalf of the American people, even in my retirement, here's what I would say is I'm hopeful, right? Like I work with young. My workforce is multi-generational. And the inspiration that I get from our young people and seeing the fire in their eyes, and it's up to us that are not so young to light that fire, to help them to see how they can rise. And I'm so hopeful in the sense that I served 38 years believing in my country. And even on the darkest day, I thought 9/11 was the darkest day, but unfortunately, January 6th became the darkest day. And I felt hope and peace because many of us ran towards what a lot of people would run away from. And that gives me hope. And so I believe that if we can find it here, right? If we can find it here in our hearts to know and do what's right and to work together through love, then we can come out of this, we can survive anything. But when we lose faith in ourselves and in each other, we're going to lose the battle. And so my thing to each of you is, let's find it through here. Let's stick together and let's do what's right for our country. We know that this country was made by many different people, not just one people, many people. So let's do what's right. And let's come together as a nation and push forward and push past this. And that also means, even if you don't like the voting choices, you gotta vote. You got to vote.
Senator?
Yeah. I'm a Democrat from North Dakota. So if you ask me about optimism, guess what? I would not be here if I wasn't fundamentally an optimistic person. But I want to tell you a story. My dad was a seasonal construction worker, lived, at least 3 months on unemployment. And I always say we prayed for a late fall and an early spring, because in North Dakota, if you do road construction, you aren't, you get 9 months, that's pretty good. And my mom was a school cook, and I grew up in a town of 90 people. And my family was 1/10 the population. I always say that. And when I say 90, I say, no, not 90,000, 90. But I remember taking office, and one of the things that you do is you gavel in the United States Senate, and then you turn and say the Pledge of Allegiance as a presiding officer. And I hadn't had a lot of time to kind of process what had happened to me, because no one thought I was going to win. And I turned and I looked at the flag and I put my hand on my heart, and I could barely finish the pledge. Not because I forgot it, but because I was overwhelmed by the power of this country, by the power of the fact that a girl from 90, a town of 90 people, dad's seasonal construction worker, mom, school cook, is standing in the United States Senate as a United States Senator, where so few people have given that opportunity. Don't let anyone tell you that this country isn't great, that we aren't great as Americans, that we aren't great in terms of what we can do when we decide to work together. The biggest threat we have is the inability to see each other as Americans, to see each other as an opportunity to build this great country to the next generation. The threat, when it's external, is always incredibly, we rally, we fight anyone who wants to take on the United States of America. What happens when that fight is about each other? And that's the threat. The threat is not to fight each other, but learn how to talk to each other, learn how to dialogue, learn how to bring the country back together against people who will divide us, against people who find political opportunity in division and not unity. And so I am optimistic because we are the United States of America, not our government. We, the people, are the United States of America. And as long as we can see each other clearly and fairly and with love and respect, we will survive anything. But we have to work together. And so this film is so important because it is a example of what can happen if we find ourselves working against each other. And so I hope you spread the word. I hope you go out and vote, but I hope you take great pride in the fact that we are the United States of America, but that we have to begin to see each other equally.
Jesse.
Rick, I'll answer the question this way. I inherited a healthy dose of paranoia from my father, and so I did recently acquire my British passport. If I need to make a hasty exit, I'll admit that. But what gives me great hope is, and what I think this exercise celebrates, is the ability of people to come together with common purpose. And I also recently made a film about teenage girls in Missouri with different politics who get together and try to talk to each other. And they have every reason to be cynical, and they are not. They are hopeful and idealistic and inspiring. And I think, to echo some of what others have said, that generation really actually gives me remarkable hope. So I can put the passport away for now, I think.
Tony.
Yeah. There's a term that I didn't know before I worked on this film that I embrace, that I share with you, and that's a normalcy bias. It's this idea that things have just always been one way, so they'll continue to be that way, and it's a very dangerous false assumption. So, and it's a powerful expression and idea. Hearing these folks speak fills me with so much emotion, and it reminds me that our film really ultimately is not about red or blue. It's about red, white, and blue, and we all need to hold on to that. And I think that's it, you know.
All right, now we have time for a few audience questions, and I think I won't be calling on people, but the Hammer staff will be going around with microphones. So raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question. And please, two requests. One, keep your questions brief, and second, keep them questions.
I think somebody at the beginning of the panel referred to the ultimate goal of the exercise was to certify the election and do it without invoking the Insurrection Act. For any of you up there, now that you've been through this, do you feel like you could get through this exercise more quickly and with greater clarity? And you may not agree with the premise.
The answer is no. Just in part because of what Ben did. Like, in as much as the way that the game kind of rolled out, and you saw an hour and a half, that was 6 hours. And I think at the end of the day, no one was thinking about that there were even cameras there. So the way that it was set up, I don't think you would ever get it through that much quicker. And then the only thing I'd add, it was to certify the election, maybe not use the Insurrection Act, and then try to do so in a way that you'd still have a country the day after.
We do have a 6-hour cut. It's kind of incredible. I could offer it to you.
But I would say the thing that happens with these tabletop exercises, right, because this is something that's very typical within the military, is that the tabletop exercise is designed to give you that experience in the event that you see something that looks like that, right? So that helps you to think a little bit ahead. When you encounter that situation in the future, you may be like, okay, I remember that, President Hot Ham here did X, or, Heidi over here talked about drones or whatever it was, right? And oh my God, I'm not going to do that. So that's the point of a tabletop exercise. If everyone could go through something like this, I think it helps you to be a little bit more informed in the event that you see something like this in the future.
And also the intent, when we first envisioned this exercise, we weren't sure that it was going to be a documentary. We thought there'd be some public-facing element to it through a series of amazing connections, through our communications director, Eric Schmelzer, who's up there somewhere, was able to connect us to this incredible crew and creative visionaries who really saw how this could be a compelling film. But originally, the idea was to do the exercise to produce a report that we'd give to the administration. And one of our biggest learnings from the exercise itself was how much space there is at the level of state government, that governors and state attorneys general and secretaries of state, do they understand the authorities related to the National Guard? What's the difference between Title 10 and Title 32? How could a president or utilize the National Guard in a way that breaks a lot of norms but isn't illegal? And so now that voice is actually, this year we're going out to states and working with swing state governors and states attorneys general and National Guard commanders to actually put them through a similar but much more limited and without a documentary crew exercise, so that they're not thinking about these things for the first time in the event of something outside of the norm happening in November or before January.
There's one confession I want to make. The participants don't know this. Jesse and Tony and Janessa do. I designed the game so that it was not winnable. I expected the White House to fail, and it's a crisis. You don't win crises, you manage them. And to the credit of the governor and his staff, they managed it. I did everything I could to get him to invoke the act. He simply wouldn't do it, and I think we're better for it, and I hope that that sets the stage for a future leader in that position, not overreaching. And so I really value that part of it.
Is that a Bullock 2028 endorsement?
Only if Heitkamp's on the ticket, too.
Take the next question.
Hello. Oh, hi. My name is Ricardo. I'm a prospective law student, hopefully at UCLA Law. I'm also a former congressional aide who worked in the House when the insurrection happened in 2021. First of all, you all were terrific. Congratulations. This was a really great exercise. My question is about another game scenario for you all. I know we don't have 6 hours, but let's imagine Trump wins in November and he's back in office in January, with the Congress easily certifying the election. Trump pardons January 6th insurrectionists, and paramilitary organizations grow while he's in office. I know I'm going into the future, but I remember 2021 just as if it were yesterday. So let's forward to 2028, and Trump's picked candidate loses the election. Assuming he doesn't run again, how do states prepare if the winning candidate is asking people to support him or her while Trump and the Congress transfer power to his picked candidate who factually lost the election? What happens then, and how do we avoid that? What do governors do?
Look, I think you saw even in January 2021 some courageous governors and others. I mean, Doug Ducey from Arizona, right, standing up and saying, we're going to go forward. A number of them. And I think reinforcing that is what we need to be doing each step of the way. But I'm hopeful that this fever breaks. I think we need to hold up those people, even that we might disagree with at times, that do. Look, I could turn around and say, to be honest, that there's never one policy that I agreed with Liz Cheney until the last one. And now I will also say that she's one of my heroes, because she did what was right when it was necessary. So at times, not getting completely in we're such a partisan nation at this point too, but not looking at just partisanship, but looking at Jesse's role, the Patriots, and underscoring that each step of the way. I talk about the 171 members of Congress that deny the results of the election. Well, let's talk about all of them that don't, and not just on the Democratic side.
Yeah, and the one thing I want to just say, I'm not going to add on to that, but I want to say to you is, I am sorry that you had to endure that. And I hope that we can help you heal.
We're going to take one more question, and then let me tell you that afterwards there's going to be a reception, and also Elizabeth's book, Kingdom of Rage. She will be out there signing books. So let's take our last question, please.
Hi. My question really is in regards to social media, and it seemed like one of the inadequacies, I'm up here in the corner if you're looking,
We can't see a thing, don't worry.
If it was social media, and I thought that the presentation, the way that you played it was great, but I thought that it seemed like you were completely inadequate in terms of the social media and how to deal with it. And I think right now our fear, and we're talking about keeping democracy, is really more about social media and the fact that it's not controllable and that it's based on profit margins in terms of trying to get people angry at each side, and it's not even about the issues. It's about and I would just say this, that watching the all that's gone on in college campuses and the things about Israel and how it got weaponized so quickly is just a sign to me that freaks me out completely about November, because I don't know what the issue is going to be, or maybe it's Israel, but that is what we have to worry about, is all of this information coming at people and then believing it before they even know the facts.
Also
Senator?
completely realistic of how government operates, having served in the executive branch for most of the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I think you said it's uncontrollable. And I think one of the things that frustrates me, I'm 38 years old, and I look at Congress and the Senate and the conversations that are happening around regulation of social media. We live in a time now where everybody is in their own little bubble. The big media that 20, 30, 40 years ago, people would all get their news from the same place. We all could we might disagree, but we agreed on the same set of facts. That doesn't exist anymore. And the fact that people are in their bubbles getting self-affirming information from influencers and outlets that agree with them or are perpetuating a worldview they already have with no checks and balances. The world doesn't have to be that way. I was a journalism student in undergraduate, and I think back on when we just had a bunch of different rag newspapers that every community, every street corner had their own newspaper that was, where they got their news from. And that's kind of the world we're in now, except that everybody has a megaphone, and the algorithm encourages rage and encourages you. If you go down one, I was telling Senator Heitkamp earlier, I got really into baking and gardening over the holidays, and suddenly I'm getting all this trad wife content, and I'm like, am I a trad wife right now? If you don't know what that is, don't look it up, because that's all the content you'll get. But it really does, and that's I'm sure someone will ask me about this after, so I'll just bring it up here. People always ask, how did your dad fall down this rabbit hole? And he is a retired man who spent a lot of time on YouTube looking up videos about how to play guitar. He's a guitarist, and he just got sucked into this algorithm that just fed him worse and worse information, and suddenly he's talking to me about Hillary Clinton drinking his baby's blood and being a lizard person, just truly bananas. But the reality is that this is controllable. And in Europe, they're actually taking some real steps using policy and regulation to control how algorithms feed people into these rabbit holes. And so we need to ask a lot more of our government. We need to be a lot more vocal, because right now it's like putting meth in the water supply. And we have an EPA for a reason. And we should be looking at social media and our media environment with the same critical lens that we would for toxins in our utilities.
Senator Heitkamp.
Can I take just a little bit different take on that? If you're waiting for regulation to save us, it's not going to happen. If you're waiting for someone else to stop all the misinformation, it's not going to happen. We have a First Amendment. We have platforms that allow people to say really stupid, crazy things. We have to do the hard work of redesigning and re-identifying each other in ways that we don't see and automatically assume absolutely the worst in each other. And so the only thing that's going to fix this is critical thinking skills and grace. And by that I mean grace to each other. When people say things that are hurtful, give them grace. When people do things that are not, consistent with your belief, don't believe they're evil people. Believe they're an opportunity to have a conversation. And until we start having conversations in this country, tough conversations on tough issues, we will not fix this. Because if you're waiting for regulation or control over platforms or algorithms, it's not going to happen. We, the people, have to take control.
But just to kind of wrap this up, I think the one thing, though, that I really want to say is, we didn't hit the media piece the way that we should have, right? And putting out that positive message or even a message. And so what I would say to you, and even if you go out and look at my social medias, right? Like, I don't go out there and cut anybody down. I don't pile on to a message that's, oh my God, this is the worst person ever, because that could really send somebody over the edge, right? Like, that could be the worst day of their life, and maybe they commit suicide, right? So you just don't know. What I would say is, if you're looking at social media and how we should be using it, is to be able to drive the messaging. Study these big companies. How do you think the large companies are successful? How do you think folks in their campaigns are successful as driving certain messaging? And so we need to make sure that if we're going into something like this, we have to control the narrative. We have to be able to push out just as much positive as much negative, and even more. And I think sometimes we forget that because we get caught up in trying to react. And we forget about, we need to be a little bit more proactive in our messaging and what we're pushing out to folks.
All right, on that note, I just want to say that the entire team that put this film together, you are a group of patriots, and you've done a great service for this country, and I hope that your message spreads far and wide. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Ain't these tears